Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly pumped you're here today because we are embarking on a really deep dive into the fascinating psychology behind exactly who we are. We're going to take a journey from the deepest, most invisible parts of our minds right out to the everyday behaviors the rest of the world sees.
But before we even get into the weeds, I want to throw a direct challenge your way. Who are you? Seriously, take just a second right now to mentally list a few traits about yourself. What are the very first words that pop into your head? Do you think of yourself as hardworking? Are you a student? A best friend? Maybe you consider yourself super outgoing or maybe a bit shy. Keep that mental list handy, all right? Because by the end of our time together, you're going to see those exact words in a completely new light.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll unpack understanding the self. Then, we'll look at the dimensions of the self. Third, culture and the self. Fourth, we'll answer the big question, what is personality? And finally, we'll compare types versus traits.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Understanding the Self.
You know, when a child is born, they actually have absolutely zero idea of a self. The biological self starts to emerge pretty early on, like, crying for milk when they're hungry. But the true psychological concept of the self, that's something that begins forming a little later in childhood. Our parents, our friends, our teachers, they all play a really vital role in shaping it. Psychology officially defines the self as the totality of an individual's conscious experiences, ideas, thoughts, and feelings regarding themselves. It's not just some casual assumption we make, it is quite literally the entire meaning we give to our own experiences.
Now remember those words you used to describe yourself just a minute ago? Well, they usually fall into one of two buckets, personal identity and social identity. Personal identity refers to the specific attributes that make you completely unique and different from the person sitting next to you. If you said, I'm honest, I'm hardworking, or I'm a musician, that is your personal identity speaking. Social identity, on the flip side, links you to a much broader social or cultural group. So if you thought to yourself, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Muslim, or I'm a New Yorker, you are defining yourself by where you belong within the larger society.
Here's where it gets kind of trippy. The self actually has a dual status. It can be understood as both a subject and an object. When you describe the self as a subject, it's the actor. It's the one actively doing the knowing, like saying, I am a dancer. But when the self is an object, it's the consequence. It's the thing being affected or observed by the world, like saying, I'm someone who easily gets hurt. We are basically constantly playing both the observer and the observed inside our own minds.
Which brings us to Section 2, Dimensions of the Self.
Think of your self-perception as being held up by three main cognitive pillars. The first pillar is self-esteem. Simply put, this is a value judgment we make about our own worth, and studies show that by age 6 or 7, kids have already formed self-esteem in 4 distinct areas: academic, social, physical competence, and physical appearance. This actually brilliantly highlights the power of parenting. Warm, positive parenting builds high self-esteem because it actively makes kids feel competent. But, and this is super interesting, parents who are overly helpful, the ones making decisions for their kids even when they don't need the help, might accidentally lower their child's self-esteem.
Our second pillar is self-efficacy. This is based on Albert Bandura's social learning theory. And it isn't just about feeling good about yourself. No, it's our concrete belief in our ability to control life outcomes or master specific situations. Let's relate this to a real-life scenario, right? A person with high self-efficacy has the absolute conviction that they have what it takes to pass a brutal exam, or they believe they can literally quit smoking the exact second they decide to do so. They select, they influence, and they construct the very circumstances of their own lives.
The third pillar is self-regulation. This refers to our ability to organize and actively monitor our own behavior. It requires a heavy reliance on willpower and the ability to delay gratification. Basically, what we casually call self-control. The Indian cultural tradition actually provides some incredible mechanisms for this, like fasting during vrata or rosa, which essentially trains your resistance to situational pressures. Psychologists also suggest techniques like self-instruction, which is literally telling yourself internally exactly how you want to behave to effectively regulate your actions.
Let's zoom out a bit for Section 3, Culture and the Self.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how different cultural backgrounds dramatically shift our understanding of the self. In the Western perspective, you see these very clear dichotomies. The boundary between the individual and the group is relatively fixed and rigid. They exist as two totally different entities kept at a distance. But look at the Indian perspective. The boundary there is permeable. It's constantly shifting. The self expands to fuse with the cosmos or the group, and then it withdraws to focus on individual needs. It's a harmonious coexistence rather than a strict, rigid separation. This right here is exactly why Western cultures are often called individualistic, while many Asian cultures are characterized as collectivistic.
Pivoting now to Section 4. What is personality?
So, to understand how all that internal self stuff translates into external, observable actions, we have to define personality. The word itself comes from the Latin word persona. That was actually the theatrical mask used by actors in Roman theater to play a specific role. Today, lay people often mistakenly use the word just to mean physical attractiveness, like saying someone who's good-looking has a charming personality. But in psychology, personality refers to the unique and relatively stable qualities that characterize an individual's behavior across totally different situations over a period of time.
Let's look at its core features. Personality has both physical and psychological components. Its expression is fairly unique to you. Its main features do not easily change over time, so, for example, a highly honest person is extremely likely to remain honest week after week, year after year. However, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, personality is also dynamic. It adapts to situational demands. You aren't just a robot. Your internal traits flex based on external environmental circumstances.
And that brings us to our final section, types versus traits.
When studying these behavioral differences, psychologists generally distinguish between two main frameworks: type approaches and trait approaches. Think of type approaches as grouping people into distinct boxes based on broad, observable behavioral patterns. You either fit into one category or another. Trait approaches, in sharp contrast, focus on specific, continuous psychological attributes. Think of this as measuring people on spectrums. You aren't just one thing or the other. You have varying degrees of shyness, friendliness, and so on.
Let's rapidly break down some of the major type approaches throughout history. The Greek physician Hippocrates actually created categories based on bodily fluids, which he called humors. Over in India, Ayurveda categorizes people into Vata, Pitta, and Kapha based on their basic temperament. There's also the Triguna system, which categorizes the dominance of Sattva, Rajas, or Tamas in a person. Now, jumping way forward, Friedman and Rosenman gave us types A, B, C, and D. Type A personalities are always rushed, heavily burdened with work, and, incredibly, this makes them highly susceptible to coronary heart disease, literally even more so than from smoking. Type B is much more relaxed. Type C is cooperative but prone to suppressing negative emotions, and Type D is prone to depression.
Another incredibly famous typology, which you have definitely heard of, was proposed by Carl Jung. He grouped people into introverts and extroverts. Introverts prefer to be alone, they might be a bit shy, and they tend to withdraw themselves when faced with emotional conflicts. Extroverts, on the other hand, are sociable, outgoing, and they react to stress in the exact opposite way, by trying to lose themselves among people and social activities.
Let's move on and see how this builds when we shift away from types and over to traits. Gordon Allport is the real pioneer here. He created a hierarchy going from the most to the least pervasive traits in a person. At the very top are cardinal traits. These are highly generalized, completely life-defining goals, like Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence. Next down are central traits. These are the general dispositions you'd probably see in a job recommendation, like being warm or diligent. And at the bottom are secondary traits. These are your least generalized preferences, like the simple fact that someone really likes mangoes or prefers wearing ethnic clothes.
Then we have Raymond Cattell, who took a highly empirical, mathematical approach to traits. He took a huge array of descriptive adjectives and applied this really complex statistical technique called factor analysis. By doing that, he distilled all of human behavioral variation down to just 16 stable source traits. For Cattell, these 16 factors basically act as the fundamental building blocks of human personality.
Man, we have covered some incredible ground today, from the cognitive pillars of our self-esteem all the way to the statistical building blocks of our personalities. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought based on everything we've just unpacked. If someone were to look at your entire life, what would they say is your cardinal trait? And when you picture the boundary between you and your community, does your self-view lean more towards the rigid lines of the West or the shifting, harmonious boundaries of the Indian perspective? Think deeply on that.